The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the chest and lingered in the corners of the rooms. The old clock on the wall ticked with slow, deliberate patience, each second falling like a reminder of days gone by. Madame Hannah sat by the window, her back slightly bent, her hands folded in her lap. At 75, her body carried the weight of years, but her eyes still searched the world with a fragile, almost childlike hope. Outside, the world was alive. The hum of cars, the laughter of neighbors, children running along the dusty street. But inside her house, silence ruled. She often found herself thinking back to the years when the house had not been so empty. When a small boy's laughter had echoed down the hallway, when tiny hands had clung to her skirt, when life had been nothing but a long string of sacrifices tied together by love. She had given everything to her son, her time, her health, her dreams, her sleepless nights. And she had done it willingly, believing that one day, her reward would be simple: a place in his heart, a seat at his table, a hand to hold when the world grew too heavy. But things had changed. Somewhere between the years of hunger and the years of abundance, between the boy who had whispered, "Mama, don't ever leave me," and the man who now carried himself like a king, a distance had grown. A distance so wide it seemed impossible to cross. The letter had arrived 2 weeks ago. A white envelope, embossed with golden edges. She had opened it with trembling fingers, thinking it was what she had dreamed of for years, a letter from her son, inviting her into his new world. But inside, there had been nothing but polite words. An announcement, not an invitation. "My wedding took place last weekend. I thought you should know. Best regards." No invitation. No seat at the table. Not even a phone call. Hannah had read the letter again and again until the paper softened beneath her fingertips. Each time, her heart broke in a new way. She thought of the nights she had gone hungry so he could eat, the clothes she had patched and repatched so he could go to school looking respectable, the dreams she had buried so his might grow. And now, when joy filled his life, when celebration and laughter surrounded him, she was left outside. The neighbors had whispered about it, too. She had overheard their pity. "Did you hear? Madame Hannah's son married a rich woman. They say he's a billionaire now. And he didn't even invite his own mother." The words clung to her skin like thorns. Still, she could not hate him. Even in her pain, love stubbornly clung to her heart. Each evening she sat by the window, staring down the road, wondering if a car might stop, if her son might appear with an apology on his lips, his arms open wide. But the road remained empty. One night, as the lamp flickered beside her, she whispered aloud to the silence, "Did I raise him wrong? Did I give too much? Or was it never enough?" Her voice cracked, fragile as dry leaves. Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away with the edge of her scarf. She had cried enough. Now she simply waited. The days stretched on like a long winter. And then, one evening, when the sun had dipped low and the street was painted with amber light, a car slowed outside her gate. Hannah's heart jolted, her breath catching in her chest. The engine hummed, the door opened, and a figure stepped out. It was him, her son, taller, broader, dressed in a suit that shimmered faintly even in the dying light. His shoes polished, his face set with a confidence that seemed carved in stone. For a moment, Hannah could not rise. She simply sat, staring, her heart trembling between joy and fear. He walked toward her, his footsteps deliberate, heavy, and when he stopped at the doorway, his eyes met hers. "Mother," he said softly, though there was a distance in his tone. Her lips trembled. She wanted to run to him, to hold him, to bury her face in his chest as she had when he was a boy. But her legs felt heavy. Instead, she whispered, "You remembered where I live." He lowered his gaze, the silence between them thick with all the years and miles that had passed. "I came to explain." Hannah nodded faintly. She had waited so long for words, any words, that she felt unprepared for them now. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair as though holding on to the very earth. And slowly, the air between them began to fill with things unsaid: regret, pride, love, and the faintest flicker of hope. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space with an unease that pressed against the walls. The scent of cologne trailed after him, foreign and sharp in a house that smelled of old wood, soap, and the faintest trace of ginger tea. He looked around, his polished shoes tapping against the floor, his eyes briefly resting on the faded curtains, the cracked frame of a photograph on the shelf, an image of himself as a boy, grinning beside a younger version of his mother. "You kept it," he said quietly, nodding toward the photo. "I kept everything," Hannah answered, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. For a moment, silence wrapped around them, heavy with memory. She wanted to ask the questions that had burned inside her since the letter arrived. Why? Why didn't you want me there? But the words tangled in her throat. Instead, he spoke first. "Mother, you wouldn't have liked it. The wedding was different. High society, business partners, people who wouldn't understand your ways. I didn't want you to feel out of place." Her hands curled into her lap. The sting of those words cut deeper than any blade. "My ways," she whispered. "Are my ways not the ones that raised you, fed you, carried you?" He shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "I didn't mean it like that." But she had heard enough. She rose slowly from her chair, her joints aching, but her spirit unwilling to bend. "Do you think I am ashamed of myself? Or that I would be ashamed of you? Child, I walked barefoot to the market so you could wear shoes. I skipped meals so you would never go hungry. I worked my hands until they bled so you could stand tall in this world. And now you tell me I would not belong at your table." Her words cracked through the air, each one trembling with pain and love. He looked at her then, truly looked. For the first time in years, he saw not the fragile old woman he had tried to push aside, but the warrior who had shaped his life. Her eyes, dark and steady, held more strength than any boardroom, any fortune, any crown he might wear. His voice faltered. I was wrong." The admission slipped out, soft as a confession. Hannah's chest rose and fell. For years she had prayed to hear those words, but now they arrived tangled with sorrow. She lowered her gaze, her voice gentle yet firm. "A mother does not need riches from her son. She needs a place in his heart. Do you have a place for me there?" He swallowed hard. His shoulders, so straight and proud when he walked in, now slumped. "Yes, always. I just lost sight of it. I thought becoming a man meant leaving behind everything that reminded me of struggle. But I see now. I left behind the one thing I should have carried with me. You." Tears burned her eyes, and this time she let them fall. Slowly, with effort, she lifted her hand. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, then reached forward and took it. His palm was warm, firm, trembling against hers. "Then let it not be too late," she said softly. "Come home, not to this house, but to me." And in that moment, years of distance collapsed. He knelt beside her chair, his head bowed against her hand, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt her son again, the boy she had raised, the boy who once clung to her skirt and whispered promises of forever. Outside, the street was quiet. The neighbors passing by glanced at the small house, unaware that within its walls, a broken bond had begun to mend. The sun dipped lower, casting the room in golden light, as if blessing the fragile reunion. Hannah closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer of thanks. Not for wealth, not for grandeur, but for the simple miracle of being seen, of being remembered, of being loved. The days that followed carried a gentler rhythm than Hannah had known in years. Her son began visiting, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with small offerings of time. A basket of fresh bread, a warm blanket for her chair. A simple meal he insisted on cooking in her old kitchen, clumsily handling the knives while she chuckled at his lack of practice. Each visit seemed to peel away a layer of distance. At first, his eyes darted nervously around, as though he expected judgment in every shadow. But soon, they softened, settling on her with the steady gaze of a child who had finally remembered his home. One evening, as rain tapped against the roof, he brought his wife. She stood uncertain in the doorway, her hands clutching a bouquet of lilies. She was elegant, dressed in silk and pearls, her perfume trailing like whispers of another world. Yet beneath the polished surface, Hannah saw something else, fear. "Welcome," Hannah said, her voice warm despite the storm in her chest. The young woman stepped forward, her eyes glistening. "I should have come sooner. I should have insisted." Hannah took the lilies, their fragrance sharp and sweet, and placed them gently on the table. "What matters is that you are here now." They shared a meal, humble stew, warm bread, laughter that stumbled at first but soon found its way. The rain outside grew heavy, but inside, The walls seemed to breathe again, filled with voices that had long been missing. Later, when her son rose to leave, he lingered at the door. "Mother," he said quietly, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." She reached for his cheek, her fingers tracing the face she had once kissed good night 1,000 times. Forgiveness is not something you earn. It is something a mother gives, because love is larger than hurt. His eyes brimmed with tears he no longer tried to hide. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though afraid to ever let go again. In the silence of that embrace, Hannah felt years of loneliness dissolve. She was no longer the forgotten mother, sitting alone in a quiet house. She was family again, not because of titles or fortunes, but because her love had endured long enough to find its way back. As dawn broke the next day, light spilled across her floorboards, turning the worn wood to gold. She sat by the window, sipping tea, her heart lighter than it had been in decades. She whispered to herself, her voice steady and sure, "I am not alone." Weeks slipped into months, and Hannah's small home began to feel alive in ways it hadn't for years. The echoes of footsteps, the murmur of conversations, the clatter of dishes after dinner, sounds that once belonged only to memory now filled her days again. Her son often arrived unannounced, carrying groceries or newspapers, sometimes bringing nothing at all but his presence. Each visit seemed to weave new threads into the fabric of their bond. He no longer wore his wealth like armor inside her house. He left the world of suits and meetings at the door, stepping into her kitchen as the boy who once licked spoons clean after she baked. One Sunday morning, Hannah heard a knock. When she opened the door, her son stood there with his wife, and a child cradled in his arms. A baby boy, his tiny fists waving in the air, his dark eyes blinking curiously at the world. "Mother," her son said softly, almost reverently, "meet your grandson." Hannah's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she reached for the child, the warmth of new life seeping into her arms like sunlight. The baby's skin was soft, his scent a mix of milk and innocence. She pressed her cheek against his head, tears sliding freely down her face. "You named him?" she asked. Her son nodded. "Samuel, after father." At the mention of her late husband, Hannah's chest tightened, but not with pain. It was gratitude, a sense that the man she once loved, the father who had worked tirelessly alongside her, was remembered in the next generation. She looked at the baby, at her son, at his wife watching tenderly from the side. The weight of loneliness she had carried for so long seemed to lift fully, replaced by something richer, fuller, a circle completed. That evening, as the baby slept in her arms and laughter filled the room, Hannah whispered a prayer not for herself, but for them. For love to guide their days, for humility to guard their hearts, for family to remain stronger than pride. That evening, as the baby slept in her arms and laughter filled the room, Hannah whispered a prayer not for herself, but for them. For love to guide their days, for humility to guard their hearts, for family to remain stronger than pride. The lamp glowed warmly against the walls, shadows dancing softly as if the house itself had come alive again. Hannah closed her eyes, listening to the gentle breathing of her grandson, the sound of her son's voice mingling with his wife's laughter. And she thought, with a fullness that needed no more words, this is what it means to be rich. As the weeks turned into seasons, Hannah's house once again became a gathering place. The once quiet walls now held the echoes of lullabies, the playful squeals of a child learning to crawl, and the soft hum of family conversations lingering long after dinner. Her son, who once stood distant and armored by pride, now lingered in her kitchen to brew tea, listening to her old stories with the patience of a man who had finally remembered where he came from. His wife, too, graceful, kind, and eager, sat by Hannah's side, asking for recipes, learning the little traditions that had lived in Hannah's hands for 75 long years. The neighbors began to notice as well. They saw Hannah walking slowly down the street, her son at her side, her grandson nestled in her arms, and they whispered in quiet awe. For a long time, she had been seen as the forgotten woman, the one left behind by success. But now she walked with her head high, surrounded by love that could not be bought or hidden. On her 76th birthday, the family gathered in her small home. There was no grand banquet hall, no chandeliers or marble floors, just a humble table draped with a white cloth, a cake baked with care, and the glow of candlelight. Her son placed his hand over hers before she blew out the candles. "Mother," he said, his voice breaking, "I know I've made mistakes. But I promise you, you will never be left behind again. You are the heart of this family." Hannah looked at him, at the boy she had raised through sacrifice and tears, now a man finally softened by the lessons of humility. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "I don't need riches, my son," she whispered. "All I ever wanted was this." Her grandson clapped his tiny hands as the candles flickered out and laughter filled the room. In that moment, Hannah knew the years of pain, of loneliness, of aching prayers had led her here, not to wealth or recognition, but to something greater. The night carried on with simple joys, the sharing of food, the retelling of stories, the warmth of belonging. And as the stars stretched quietly over the sky, Hannah sat in her chair, her heart finally at peace. For though she had lost much along the way, she had gained something far richer, her family, whole again. And with that, her story, once heavy with sorrow, closed in the gentle light of love's redemption.